developed, he had to go along and agree with attacks on oil refineries, military targets, and in particular, as the year 1940 wore on, Hermann Göring's Air Force began the attacks on British fighter defences, the airfields, the radar installations, and that began to tear a hole in Britain's fighter defences. May the 10th, 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, and this really threw a wrench in Hitler's plans. Neville Chamberlain was peaceable. There was a big peace movement in England by the summer of 1940. Peace movements can be very powerful, and in England, peace movements could get right through to number 10 Downing Street, because there were no gates in Downing Street at that time. Margaret Thatcher put those gates up into there now, at both ends of number 10. In those days, demonstrations could march down Downing Street up to number 10 and stand outside Churchill's window and scream and say, "We are tired of your war, we want peace." And it happened. There were repeated demonstrations outside his windows. I've seen those. They're mentioned in his desk calendar on the diary, another demonstration outside. In his own cabinet there were demonstrations. 3 members of his cabinet wanted peace immediately. They saw what the war was doing to Britain and our economy and our empire. There was Lord Beaverbrook, who was the Canadian Prime Minister, he was Canadian press lord, press he owned the Daily Express newspapers in England, the Evening Standard, the Sunday Express. I knew him. And he was a very great man. He knew what was what. Lord Beaverbrook, Churchill had given him, to silence him, a position in the cabinet as Minister of Aircraft Production, but he wanted peace. So did Neville Chamberlain, the outgoing Prime Minister. So did Lord Halifax, our own Foreign Minister. Churchill solved that problem by eventually sending Lord Halifax to the United States, exiling him as ambassador in Washington. So he was no risk anymore. But in 1940, in the summer of 1940, Chamberlain and Beaverbrook and Lord Halifax were there in Churchill's cabinet. There were 3 other ministers who wanted war. They were more warlike inclined, but Churchill held the casting vote, but he hesitated. He was a warmonger. He knew the king didn't like him. The Queen didn't like him. The Queen was actually beginning to plot with the admirals to overthrow Churchill. We know this from the private diaries of some of the admirals. The King of England, King George VI, he made no secret of it. He told visiting statesmen from the United States and Canada that he hated this Prime Minister that had been dumped on him, his First Minister, Winston Churchill. He regarded him as a useless warmonger and a threat. He said this to Harry Hopkins, who wrote it down in his papers. He said it to Sumner Wells, who visited in London in March 1940 to see if there's any chance of peace. The King said it to Mackenzie King, one of my heroes, this Canadian Prime Minister. I love the guy. He's completely nutty, but Prime Minister of Canada. Every decision he took was guided by the hands of the clock on the wall. If they were pointing exactly in a straight line like 6 o'clock, that was a good omen. If they were opposed to each other, or covering each other like 1:05, then that was a bad omen, and you had better cancel immediately the decision you just took. The whole way through his diary is saying, I looked up at the clock and it was 1:05, so I revoked the decision I'd taken. In Volume 2 or Volume 3 of Churchill's War, we find that August the 17th, 1943, Churchill comes to Mackenzie King, the Quebec Conference, and pleads for distilleries to be reopened because the British officers' messes need the whiskey, and the Canadians have shut down the distilleries for war manufacture, war production, and now the British officers' messes are not getting. So Mackenzie King says, well, if you'll get your Quartermaster General to tell us how many distilleries you need reopened and how many cases of whiskey you need every year, we'll have a look at the matter. And sure enough, a day or two before, the Quartermaster General of the British government advised to the Canadian government a 1-page memorandum, as Churchill's always dictated, saying we need 50,000 cases of whiskey per annum for the British Army's officers' messes. And Mackenzie King he's inclined to agree to it. When, as he writes in the diary, I looked up at the clock on the wall and it was 1:05. And he said this, so the decision was absolutely not. And the British archives are full of why on earth was this weird decision taken by the Canadian government against all expectations. And I know the answer because I've read Mackenzie King's diaries. And one day he's taking 14 or 15 decisions, looking up the hands of the clock, or listening to his dog, who had been dead for several years, and the dog was coming to him in his dreams. And Adolf Hitler was coming to his dreams and advising him on certain steps of his work. Quite frankly, he dictates it into his diary the following day to his private secretary, Mackenzie King. And it's quite funny, because you imagine the private secretary thinking, well, it's my job's on the line, so I'm just going to type down what the old fool's telling me. And he's, after all, just Prime Minister. The war was run by lunatics, all round, whereas ordinary people were the ones doing the dying. 1940, London was not being bombed, much to Churchill's dislike. He wanted the bombing of London to begin. He needed the bombing of London to begin for three reasons. First of all, and quite properly, this was going to be a means of tricking the Americans into coming into the war, to prove how schrecklich, how frightful the Germans were, that man in Berlin. Secondly, he wanted to take the weight off the fighter stations and the radar stations, who were beginning to suffer under the tread of Hermann Goering's Air Force. Thirdly, he wanted to kill the peace movement in his own country. Once the bombing began, that's how the British are. They would stand up, they would shoulder to shoulder, stand up and fight back. People say, Mr. Irving, you're anti-Semitic, and I say I'm not. I've got lots of people, lots of Jews who are perfectly reasonable. I like Steven Spielberg, I like Walter Matthau, I like all these Jews. But if the Jewish community as such decides they're going to disadvantage David Irving by networking against him and putting pressure on his publishers and the credit card companies and God knows whatever else they do, the printers, I've seen it coming up from every angle because I'm in the eye of the storm. But I'm going to fight back. That doesn't mean to say that I'm anti-Jewish, but I know how to fight back. And that's how the British were. Churchill knew that when the first bombs fell on London, that would be the end of the peace movement. If only he could persuade Hitler to do that. But Hitler was no fool. Hitler knew what the game was. And that's why he'd ordered no reprisals against the Jews when they began assassinating his ambassadors and ministers. And he wasn't going to fight back by bombing London. Then one afternoon, as the German Air Force came up the Thames to attack the oil refinery at Rotherhithe, one bomber lost its way in the London fog, the summer fogs. Went one loop too far up the Thames. They dropped his bombs inside London, inside the boundaries of Greater London. Nobody was hurt, nobody was killed, very little damage was done. But technically, Hitler had now bombed London, said Churchill. It was Saturday evening. At 9:10 the following morning, Winston Churchill picks up the telephone. He's out at Chequers, his country house. He's not speaking upon the cabinet. He's not been discussing this with the general staff, chiefs of staff. He picks up the telephone at 9:10 that Sunday morning and telephones Bomber Command headquarters at High Wycombe, not far away from where he lives. And he says, I want a mass bombing raid against Berlin tonight of 100 bombers. No doubt at all. I found the war diary of RAF Bomber Command headquarters, and there's that phone call from the Prime Minister at Chequers, ordering this massive air raid on the centre of Berlin by the British Air Force. RAF Bomber Command, not stupid, they say, Prime Minister, you do realise what the consequences will be. The consequences will be immediate reprisals by the Germans against London, the centre of London, and it will result in thousands of British casualties. Churchill didn't mind. He's never even sat on a British bus. He doesn't know the price of a loaf of bread. He doesn't matter how many English people die in this air raid he wants to start. So he says, I'm ordering it. Then the RAF Bomber Command tries a second attack. They say, you do realise, Prime Minister, that the German Air Force is based on airfields just 100 miles from London, whereas our airfields are 1,000 miles from Berlin. We're not going to be able to get to London, we're not going to be able to get from England to Berlin and back in the space of one night. Either going out or coming back, the bomber force will be flying in broad daylight, and they will be decimated. Churchill said, I'm ordering you to go ahead with the air raid. And so that night 100 bombers went to Berlin. They didn't all find Berlin. Very few found Berlin, because our bombing at night wasn't very good. And Hitler immediately flew to Berlin to be with his people. That's in the war diary of the German High Command. He said it would be wrong for him to remain down on the mountain top in his country cottage when the people of Berlin are under attack. He flies to Berlin publicly to join them. Churchill always did exactly the opposite. Whenever Churchill knew that London was going to be attacked in later months, he took great care not to be there. He knew 85% of the time when London was the target, for three reasons. The blind bombing beams, two German blind bombing beam systems, one called Excurate, the other called Knickerbein, codenamed. Two beam stations would transmit radio beams which would intercept. They would be calibrated to intercept just over the target. And the bomber pilots would look down and see, oh, that's Coventry underneath, or London, or whatever. Regent's Park was one target. So the British would send up their decoded messages and found out about Knickerbein and the Excurate, and they knew that the Germans were using blind bombing beams, and they would send up a Spitfire with orders to stiff along one beam until they found the second beam, and they would then know what was going to be the target for that night, because the Germans would switch on the beams pretty late that afternoon to calibrate them. The second method was that we had decoded the German Air Force operational signals, the Enigma code, by June 1940. The third method was the weather. The Germans would send up a weather plane to check the weather over the target area. The difficulty for the Germans fighting the war was that they didn't have a level playing field. The weather came from west to east over England, and then went on to Germany. So we knew what the weather was going to be, and the Germans didn't unless they had a weather plane right out over the Atlantic or over the target area. So that would be a third clue to us that tonight's something big. So we knew when London was going to be bombed, and Churchill took very great care not to be there. He would go out to the back garden gate, number 10, the brick wall is still there, bought his Daimler motor car, and say, driver, take me out to Oxfordshire. 100 miles out to Oxfordshire, where he then lives overnight in the country mansion of a friend of his, the Conservative Member of Parliament, Rudolf Hess I. But Churchill didn't spend the night in London during the big air raids. The following morning he would come back to number 10 Downing Street when all the bombing was finished, and he would put on an Air Commodore's uniform with the Royal Air Force. I don't know what legitimacy he had to wear that uniform, but anyway, the photographs show him wearing this uniform. And he goes and tours the East End of London, where the bombers had been, the working class areas, piles of ruins where the houses had stood. The Londoners standing by saying, good old Winston, giving him the V-side, or he gave them the V-side, and the Londoners would be sticking paper flags in the ruins, the Union British flag, and they'd be shouting, good old Winston, if you can take it, we can too. But he couldn't take it. I mean, the opposite of Hitler. He went to his little air raid shelter out in Oxfordshire, to be absolutely certain. I'm not going to say I wouldn't have done the same thing in his position. We had the flying bombs overhead. We had quite a lot of the war when I was there in the country. Hitler didn't respond. Not to that first raid, not to the second, not to the third or fourth. Getting angrier and angrier, though. September the 4th, Hitler made a famous speech at the Sportpalast in Berlin, the biggest hall, tens of thousands, a chosen audience. He made a speech in which he said, this madman in London, he's now trying to provoke us, but he doesn't seem to realize that we have a real air force here. Now we can smash their cities. If we chose to, we could. If he drops 10 tons of bombs, we can go back and drop 100. If he drops 100 tons of bombs on our towns, so I can go back and drop 1,000 tons. And I will one day. I will one day. If they come and destroy, to say they can destroy our cities, he said, I will rub out theirs, ausradieren. I will rub out their cities. Very famous speech, which is what Churchill was waiting for. Very next day, September the 5th, he orders a mass air raid on Berlin. Finally, on September the 6th, broad daylight that afternoon, the London population could hear the tread of the approaching German bombers coming up the Thames. Hundreds upon hundreds of German bombers, I remember when I was a child, every child my age, I was 4 or 5, we knew the difference between a Dornier and a Heinkel, the Junkers. They had different engine sounds. The BMWs, the Umo engines, the Junkers planes. The Heinkel plane had 2 engines. They were twin-engine bombers, all twin-engine bombers. But the Heinkel engine was slightly asynchronous, so the engine note rose and fell. There was a famous grey and green novel called Ministry of Fear, in which the little man who's running for his life across the countryside, actually we find out at the end of the book that he's wanted to murder, but he hears these Heinkel squadrons approaching, and he hears this rising and falling note that I remember so well. And the little man thinks, I hate those bombers. It sounds as they're saying, I know where you are. I'm coming for you. I'm coming for you. I'm coming for you. And the British public were very stoical under bombardment. I know that. It's another story. But this was the German reply finally to Hitler's provocation. And that afternoon, September the 6th, 1940, the beginning of the Blitz, 6,000 Londoners were killed and wounded injured in that air raid. It's what Churchill wanted. And nobody likes to write that, of course. You won't find a word of this in the Martin Gilbert biography. This was Churchill. You won't find anything about his 10 past 9 phone call to Bomber Command call. You won't find any of that. The fact that he deliberately started the saturation bombing campaign was the opposite of what Hitler had wanted. Now, Churchill had tricked him into the move that he never wanted to make. He sends for Rudolf Hess, we're now back on the story again. In fact, he sends for Rudolf Hess in the last week of August. And he says privately to Rudolf Hess, whom he very rarely sees now, because the war's on, he says, Herr Hess, you've got these aristocratic friends of yours in England you're always talking about. Can't you contact them in some way and tell them that we want nothing from the British? That we just want peace? We want an end to the war? Can't you get this message across to the British people somewhere? Have you got these contacts there? Well, Hess's contacts weren't in England, but except the Germans always say England when they mean Britain. His contacts were in Scotland. The Duke of Hamilton, particularly. Duke of Hamilton visited Berlin in 1936 during the Olympic Games. And in fact, when I sat down there in the basement reading through all the Rudolf Hess papers, years after I read the book, I found a large empty envelope in one of the files, a file for correspondence, letter H. And it was an envelope which had obviously once contained a large portrait photograph. Typed on the outside of the envelope was the name, the Duke of Hamilton, in English. So the Duke of Hamilton sent him a signed photograph from 1938, which is interesting to know. Frequently, when you're writing history, frequently what isn't there is more important than what is there. That photograph had been removed for some reason, probably by Eric Lippmann or someone like that, when the files were gone through. But it does show that Hess and Hamilton knew each other. It does show that there had been a contact and that Hamilton had responded. Because Hamilton in later years tried to make out that all this came as a complete surprise to him. He couldn't understand what Hess was up to. And other people have said, well, Hamilton was obviously in league with the Secret Service. Perhaps Hamilton was actually part of a plot to lure Rudolf Hess across the English Channel into British captivity. There have been all sorts of speculation, and as long as all the Rudolf Hess files remain closed, we can't really reach a final conclusion. But Hitler had said this to Rudolf Hess: you've got these friends in Britain, now you can surely contact them and tell the British that we want nothing. This is an echo of what Hitler's secretary, Christa Schroeder, one of the four secretaries, told me. Christa Schroeder, this old woman, she died in 1983, she was a lovely woman. She was Hitler's private secretary from 1935 to 1945. And she had a woman friend who lived in Switzerland. And after many years, Christa Schroeder finally revealed that, yes, she had written regular letters to this woman friend in Switzerland describing life with Adolf, life with the chief. And she eventually provided his letters to me. She had gone through them with scissors, cutting out certain paragraphs that I shouldn't read, literally cutting them out with scissors. Or she'd photocopied pages and redacted them. There's one letter she wrote June the 24th, 1940, at the end of the battle, at the end of the fighting in the West. Hitler now, in June 1940, was the master of the whole of Europe, from northern North Cape all the way down Scandinavia to the Spanish frontier. And France had defeated. France had now, a couple of days earlier, signed the armistice. The war was over. As Adolf Hitler said at that luncheon, he said, millions of wives and sweethearts around the world would breathe a sigh of relief that the war is now fighting, the war has now come to an end, if the British now stop. Because we had declared war on Germany. And he said there's a lunch with Christa Schroeder and a couple of others, and she reports this to her woman friend in Switzerland. She said, had lunch with the chief today. It was so interesting to hear him speak. He says this about wives and sweethearts and how grateful they will be that the war is now over. If only the British will see reason, and if only he could bring it home to the British, he wants nothing from Britain at all. This was the German peace offer. He wants nothing from Britain or the British at all. He wants nothing from the British Empire. The British have declared war on Germany. The British have done severe damage to Germany by bombing raids, but he says he's not going to ask for any compensation for the damage they've done. He just wants the war over. And then he can settle down his ambitions, which is a campaign in the East, and he hopes the British will see reason and allow him to do what he wants in the East. This basically is what he said at that luncheon and subsequently to Rudolf Hess, and that was the German peace offer. The letter proves it. I mean, I've got a copy of the letter that she wrote. This was Hitler's intention. He was a great admirer of the Empire, the British Empire. Rightly so. And he felt that, he said, in fact, on other occasions, he said, if the British Empire should ever be threatened by any outside force, meaning Japan, as he says specifically, he said Japan, including Japan, Italy, and the Soviet Union, who were his own allies, he said if they were to threaten the British Empire, he will provide the British Empire with forces to throw the aggressors out. This was our enemy, apparently thanks to Winston Churchill. But Hitler is trying desperately in the summer of 1940 to end it, and he brings Rudolf Hess and he says, contact your friends in Britain, for God's sake, tell them we want nothing from them. The bombing hasn't yet begun, the bombing nightmare hasn't yet begun. And Rudolf Hess, instead of immediately acting, he unfortunately goes down the other route that the Germans always seem to take. As Winston Churchill once scoffed or sneered so rightly, the Germans are incapable of staging a military revolution because it would mean walking on the grass, meaning figuratively. The Germans very proper. Rudolf Hess, instead of immediately taking steps to contact his friends in Britain, although of course there are no telephone lines or internet in those days, he decides to write a letter in English. He wants to get it right. But he calls in his friend, Gauleiter Ernest Bohler, B-O-H-L-E, who was head of the Auslandsorganisation, the head of all Germans abroad, so to speak. Rudolf Hess calls in Ernst Bohler, who was born in England, therefore knows English. Born in Bradford, in fact. Well, nowadays, believe me, if you want to learn English, you don't go to Bradford or Hartlepool or somewhere like that, because not only you cannot speak the language they speak, can't live was one of my stops on this tour, and I said to the local waitresses, I'm sorry, but I'm from southern England, and I can't understand what a word you're saying. But in Bradford now, the population is 90% black and Pakistani. So you don't go to England there, you don't ask a Bradford person to, but Ernst Bohler and Rudolf Hess, they sit down and they work on the letter. Every comma, every full stop is important. They want to make absolutely certain. It's typically German, instead of acting. Again and again, look at the attempts to kill Hitler. The attempts to kill Hitler, there were two major attempts during the war. One by a single-handed man, Georg Elser, who was a clockmaker, who worked away chiseling out a cavity in a pillar behind where Hitler stood and spoke every November, lining it with cork and putting in a meticulously made clockwork mechanism that would trigger the bomb, which he put in there, which killed 8 people eventually, I think, or a dozen people. But not Hitler, who had left the hall 8 minutes earlier. And the entire German general staff, who tried to kill Hitler in July 1944, but failed. Because they worked for months ahead, plotting and planning and discussing who's going to be the minister of this and who's going to be the minister of that in the post-Hitler era. And I want that job. No, you can't have it. We've given that to somebody else. And eventually failed to kill Hitler. But through their sheer bungling. It's just typically German again. And here's Rudolf Hess making the same mistake. Eventually the letter is sent off, sometime in December 1940. It's sent to Scotland, addressed to the Duke of Hamilton. But it goes, first of all, to Mrs. Wilson in Lisbon, who has agreed to see the letter reaches the Duke of Hamilton. The letter doesn't reach the Duke of Hamilton because Mrs. Wilson is a British Secret Service agent. The letter is now in the British government archives. I've seen it. It never reaches the Duke. Or if it did reach the Duke, he kept very quiet about it. The letter contained the German peace offer, just as Hitler had outlined it, repeatedly. Wants nothing from the British, just wants the fighting to end, the killing to stop. And he will then take action against the Jewish Bolshevik leadership in Moscow, who weren't our allies at the time, so no skin off our nose. People say, Mr. Irving, are you really suggesting that Hitler should have been allowed to go ahead, enslaving the whole of Eastern Europe, turning all these countries, putting them under the hands of a dictatorship? Nazi, I said, well, that's what he did in 1945. He turned his back on Eastern Europe and turned them all over to a Soviet dictatorship. The difference being, of course, that we killed 4 or 5 million people in a horrible saturation bombing, burned them alive. We destroyed Europe's most beautiful cities. And we lost our own empire. We bankrupted our own empire fighting this ridiculous war. That's the difference that Winston Churchill made. And, of course, the Holocaust, which began after this peace offer had been turned down. Whatever the Holocaust was, it wouldn't have happened if Churchill hadn't, for his own reasons of personal prestige and power, decided to ignore the peace offers and carry on fighting, so that he would go down in history as the man who saved Britain, the greatest Englishman ever. And in fact, it turns out he wasn't. Until May 1941, he had only had a string of deceits and defeats and personal disasters. His first personal victory, I suppose, was when the Royal Navy sank the battleship Bismarck at the end of May 1941. That was a fluke. Rudolf Hess tries then, he waits for many weeks and gets no reply to the letter. He realizes that he's failed again. He had hoped that he was going to win new glory, new laurels, as the man who saved the world from war, the horrors of saturation bombing, the man who single-handed brought the war to an end, but he's not going to succeed because they're not even replying to his letter. Then he decides on one desperate gamble. If I don't get a reply to the letter, I will fly personally to visit the Duke and land on the airfield and land on the field next to him. An extraordinary thing to say. He had no plane, he had no flying experience in the Messerschmitts, he had no... And in fact, Hitler had forbidden him to fly. Hitler had forbidden all the top Nazis like Heydrich and the rest who had flying ability to fly planes because of the risk that they were going to lose their lives in some ridiculous flying accident or be shot down by the enemy. Heydrich, in fact, went to Norway and fought in the Norwegian campaign as an aviator, defying Hitler's orders. Rudolf Hess had been in aviation in World War I, but not since then. His best friend in Bavaria is William Messerschmitt, Professor William Messerschmitt, the aircraft designer, after whom all the planes were named. They should have named the planes after the engine designers, not after the fuselage designers, of course, because it's the engine, basically I fired a plane as a flying engine with kind of things sticking out of the side. It's the engine that makes the plane. But the Messerschmitt 109 was their biggest success, a single-engine fighter plane, a day fighter plane it was used as, followed by the Messerschmitt 110, a much heavier plane, much more complicated, technically complicated. It had a crew of 3. It needed a lot of skill to fly the 110. And it needed 3 people. Hess contacts William Messerschmitt and says, "Can you give me a plane?" Messerschmitt, for some reason, says, "Well, yes, we can do that, of course. It'll go onto the account, it'll go onto the tab for the government will pay for it." And then a few weeks later, Rudolf Hess comes to Messerschmitt again. We've got Messerschmitt's papers in England. They're hidden in the archives of the War Museum in London, which now has a huge Holocaust wing, so it's anything to do with the British people. But in the Messerschmitt papers there, trawling as I do from left to right, writing my Adolf Hitler book, I found 3 or 4 pages that suddenly come alive. There's Rudolf Hess, the Deputy Führer, has come to me, writes Rudolf Hess, writing to Willy Bulker, who is his chief designer, and he says he's asked if he can have a plane. And then a few weeks later, Messerschmitt says, the Deputy Führer has asked for certain extraordinary modifications to be made to the plane. He wants to have it equipped with much more specialized radio beacon apparatus so he can fly long journeys with it. He didn't explain to me why. And then a week later, he says, Rudolf has asked for the oxygen equipment for the plane to be adapted so that the co-pilot oxygen seat, oxygen equipment supply can be switched onto his supply for the pilot alone because he's going on a long flight and he intends to do it single-handed. I forgot to ask him what he intends to do with this mission, but no doubt he knows what his plans are because he is, after all, Deputy Führer. Of course, years later you realize that with that sentence going through your mind. Messerschmitt is covering his butt there. If anything goes wrong, or these letters are found, or if anything goes wrong, and people say, Messerschmitt, why did you supply a plane to this madman for this mission which has caused us so much damage? I can say, well, he's Deputy Führer, so I assumed that he knew what he was doing, and so did the Führer. This became a big question, of course. How much did Hitler know? The Gestapo investigated after the flight of Rudolf Hess. How much did Hitler know? After the first edition of that book was published, I found a guy in California called Erich von Benstoff, who has the entire original Gestapo interrogation reports on Rudolf Hess's staff. And all of them were questioned on this one point, because it was the one thing the Gestapo wanted to clear up first. Because if Hitler authorized what the Deputy Führer was doing, they weren't going to, they were on eggshells. If this was with Hitler's permission, then we're not going to get down into it. On the other hand, if it turns out Hitler was totally in the dark about this, and that's high treason, and we very much should get into it. That's the job of the Gestapo. So all these people, Rudolf Hess's adjutants and secretaries and the rest of them, all asked this question: how much did Hitler know? And they all kind of were baffled. We don't know. Christa Schröder asked Hitler about it months later. She said, I'm sure the Rudolf Hess business. How much were you aware of what was going to happen? He said frankly to her, well, in retrospect, I can understand now what he was going on about. When he said to me, after the big speech in the Reichstag, I spoke at the Reichstag on May the 4th, 1941. I spoke there, and afterwards he came out to my office in the Chancellery building and said, I'm sure I want to have a few words with you. Yes, go ahead. Herr Reichsleiter he was at that time, or Vice Minister. And he said, tell me one thing. Is your attitude to Britain and the British people the same as when we had that conversation back in August? And Hitler said, of course. Rather irritably, probably. Nothing has changed. Why should I change my mind? I've always liked them. Thank you, I'm sure. That's all I needed to know. And Hitler says to Christa Schröder later on, now I understand what he was getting at. And sometimes we wonder how much Hitler also said to Rudolf Hess, finding out what he was actually planning to do. Hess, you do realize that if this mission succeeds, you're going to be the great hero. On the other hand, if it fails, we will have to disown you and pretend that you are a lunatic. Rudolf Hess, in fact, did have a mental problem. In 1936, his doctor had diagnosed, unofficially, paranoid latent schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a curse of our age. 1% of the population has schizophrenia, more or less. There's a lot more in the Caribbean. Oh yes, any doctor will tell you this. Schizophrenia is not of itself dangerous or damaging. It comes in varying degrees. It bubbles to the surface like marsh gas and the unfortunate afflicted people. My oldest daughter is schizophrenic, I'm sorry to say. And she discovered that when 1981, and she was deeply upset by it. She said, why does it have to be me? And I then broke it to her. I said, 1% of the population has it, schizophrenia. And I then, shortly after she told me that, I said to her sisters, I said, if she kills me, you mustn't begrudge her, and you must tell her that I understand, because that's what schizophrenics do. Literally, they will kill one or other parent, seeing in them the devil that they see everywhere else. They hear voices, they It's a very sad condition, and it can be latent in somewhere throughout their life. But also it can be triggered by something. In a teenager, it can be triggered by examination stress. Or older people can be triggered by taking amphetamines. That will also trigger schizophrenia. It's the opposite of Parkinsonism. One is an excess of dopamine, the other one is a lack of dopamine, a shortage. Rudolf Hess was diagnosed by his doctor as having latent paranoid schizophrenia, which didn't bubble to the surface very much, except when you look at looking at the Riefenstahl videos, Leni Riefenstahl's videos of the Nazi Party rallies, where he was the keynote speaker, and she's right up close with her lenses taking pictures. He has this fanatical look in his eyes, this gleam of mein Führer, and she has this kind of gleam in his eyes that you can say, well, yes, now you say it. It does look as though there's something excessively fanatical about this man. It was there. She took two movies, in fact, of course. There's the Triumph of the Will, which is the one you see in all the movies, repeatedly quoted by television pictures about the Third Reich. But a year before that, she took another film of the 1933 Party rally, September 1933, called Victory of Faith. And Hitler ordered every copy destroyed. Because she closes on, with her lenses, on Adolf Hitler. He shakes hands with Ernst Röhm and embraces him, and the great man, the brown shirt leader, who only a few months later comes to a very sticky end in The Night of the Long Night. So the film became politically incorrect. And even as she was working in the cutting room perfecting the film for movie theaters, Hitler ordered every copy destroyed because it damaged his image. All the people who had been dismissed as traitors, there he is being nice to them. It's on the table there. One copy survived in the actual film. When she died, aged 103, her website said, regretted the fact that this movie had never surfaced again and was deemed to have been permanently destroyed, and perhaps a copy may turn up in Russian archives. No, a copy was in private hands in Germany. The guy who made it available for that DVD copy to be made was a very good DVD copy. He was then arrested and imprisoned by the present German government. So you can't please everyone. He couldn't please everyone. But anyway, there's Rudolf Hess being fanatical. So there's this, and his gradual descent into madness is one of the sad things about the book on Rudolf Hess, which brings me to why I wrote it. In the archives, you find historians who, as I said, they drill straight down, know exactly what file and document they're looking for. And the other kind of historian like me who will realize that not every document of importance has been listed in the inventories. But the only way to find them is to start sideways, going in with a bulldozer and sweeping through the entire collection of records from left to right with a net, seeing what you find. In Suitland, Maryland, there's a record center, or there was a record center called the Federal Record Center, which was an outpost of the National Archives. And you find the real historians sitting there at tables with truckloads of documents next to them, doing what I do. Truckloads of documents, each with about 30 or 40 of these big 4-inch boxes on them. And in 2 or 3 weeks you go through perhaps the entire records of the Nuremberg trial, or the entire prosecution records, or all the original records have been collected for that trial. Just trawl from left to right. And I'm sitting there with my assistant, Susanna Scott Hall, and we're sitting there one day, and I've opened this box of records of the prosecution, and there are 26 exercise books. And stamped on the cover, no, not this one. Morel. No, not Morel. They stamped on the cover these exercise books, buff-colored exercise books, stamped on the cover the initials G, then the British Crown, R, George Rex, King George VI. That was the wartime logo, so to speak, of the British War Department. So these are British exercise books in American archives, with handwritten notations on the cover. When you all sorted them out, you realize that they run from May 1941 through to October 1945, and immediately a little light bulb went on in my brain and said, oh, Rudolf Hess, May the 11th, 1941, October 1945. Is this something to do with him? And I opened it up, and his name doesn't figure. These are diaries kept by Secret Service doctors and specialists and consultants on the observations, detailed, paragraph-long observations on a prisoner referred to as Prisoner Z, who was being held in a camp called Camp X, Mitchett Place, in southern England. And it is Rudolf Hess who's under observation. The doctors are writing down everything he does, everything he says, everything he remarks, everything, all his mannerisms, medication he's getting, the food he's getting. They're writing it all down, very descriptive. Prisoner X was observed today wrapping up samples of his food in packages of paper and labeling each one and putting them into a larger package. Prisoner Z was observed in the darkened cell, standing in the corner of the darkened cell speaking to somebody for a long time. But then we realized there's nobody else in the cell with him. This is a house that had been specially built for him with microphones in every room, recording every word he says. Down in southern England, next to Aldershot, next to the big army camp. What did he say there? Well, a week or two after he arrived, the British government decided to play a trick on him. They were going to send a British cabinet minister to speak with him, to raise in him the hope that perhaps his mission was going to succeed, and find out what his offer was, what the German offer was. But the real job this cabinet minister would have would be to find out any secrets he knew inadvertently, get him to blurt them out. The person they chose was Lord Simon, Sir John Simon, the Lord Chancellor, who was the head of the British legal profession, a qualified trial lawyer, who would be very good at interrogating people cleverly. And in Sir John Simon's papers in the University of Oxford now, the Bodleian Library, an ancient kind of 500-year-old library in the University of Oxford, they've got Sir John Simon's papers, and there is a transcript of their entire conversation with Rudolf Hess. A dog in your pocket? So there's this transcript, and it's transcript number 248. So we know that there had already been 247 conversations recorded, which have not been released to the archives yet, and I want to see them. And in that, Sir John Simon tries very hard to get this German prisoner, who they now know as Rudolf Hess, of course, to reveal any secrets that he's carrying. Of course, he knows where the bodies are buried. He knows where the submarines are being built. He knows the damage being done by the air raids. He knows where the submarine parts are being prefabricated, what towns are factories and so on. All the information that Britain needs. This guy has inadvertently blundered into the British camp. Let's find out what he knows. And during the interview, from the transcript, he said to Rudolf Hess, "Why on earth did you come over? What was your reason for coming over?" This is part of the softening up process. Rudolf Hess has a chance. This is a very brief reply. "Why did I come over?" He said, "In my mind's eye, I kept seeing in Germany and Britain alike an endless line of children's coffins, with weeping mothers standing behind them. And then again, the coffins of mothers, with their children clustered behind them." That's the actual wording of Rudolf Hess answering Sir John Simon, that he had these nightmares, night after night, of what would happen if the saturation bombing campaign began on either side. Here's a picture of it, a year later, in Cologne, in a hangar in the middle of Cologne. And there's hundreds of bodies laid out there ready for being put in, the mothers and their children. As a result, and Rudolf Hess said that was the nightmare which drove him to make that desperate flight. So after he had that conversation with Hitler on May the 4th, 1941, he began making the attempt. He had made one or two attempts before. He began actually in January 1941. He made his first flight with the plane, but the plane wasn't ready. It wasn't nearly up to standard. And after an hour in the air, he turned around and came back and landed on a factory airfield in Augsburg in southern Germany. His adjutant, Alfred Pinch, was there. And Rudolf Hess had actually given him a letter. He said, "After I've gone, I want you to take this letter to Hitler, which tells Hitler I've gone and what I'm going to be doing when I'm gone." He didn't say that to Pinch. He just says, "I've written a letter, I want you to carry it to the Fuhrer. And when I've gone on this mission, on this flight, if I don't come back, you're going to take it to Hitler the next day, right?" And being German, Alfred Pinch just quite said, "Jawohl, I'll do that." And Hess took off once or twice, but gave up each time. After this conversation with Hitler, he then made a second attempt, on about May the 5th or 6th, but gave up. After 2 hours, the plane comes back out of the darkness and lands on the airfield. On that occasion, Rudolf Hess has put on the uniform. He has put on his flight lieutenant's uniform, the Luftwaffe lieutenant's uniform, and the tunic and the badges and the emblems and the fur-lined boots and the Snoopy helmet. And he's asked Pinch to take a photograph of him standing on the wing of the plane, because this is going to be the mission that saves the world, that prevents the nightmare. Alfred Pinch takes the photograph. But after 2 hours, the plane comes back out of the darkness, lands on the airfield, and Hess doesn't say why. He's had to abort the mission. But a week later, he does it again. May the 10th, 1941. May the 10th, 1941, perhaps coincidental, or perhaps this is the occasion. The entire German Air Force is bombing London that night, the biggest air raid on London of the entire war. The Houses of Parliament are destroyed. buildings up and down the city are destroyed. The whole of the centre of London is in flames. The whole of the British Fighter Defence Force is centred on London to fight off the attackers. Except for one plane, a Messerschmitt 110, which is spotted by the radar system flying up England, flying over the North Sea. Dead line over Germany, rather, from Augsburg all the way up to the north coast. Then out over the North Sea. And in the North Sea it begins to fly a strange rectangular pattern in the hours of the afternoon. And nobody knows quite what's happening. Rudolf Hess knows what's happening because in the bedroom where he sleeps in Hinterland, he's had on the wall charts. He's memorizing all the charts. He's memorized the radio beacons. He's memorizing everything. He looks at the charts. He's arranged all that year in 1941 to have the weather forecast sent to him every day, 3 or 4 times a day. And people say, why does the Deputy Führer need to have the weather forecast sent to him? But nobody asks. He's arranged to have extra radar stations set up on the north coast. He arranged, because he's able to do that. He's Deputy Führer. And he arranges to have all that done. He put all the equipment on the plane, everything's ready for the flight, and he takes off. And he begins flying this rectangular pattern over the North Sea, exactly, waiting for the dusk to fall. He doesn't want to be so stupid as to try flying towards Edinburgh unless something like dusk is beginning, because he's going to get shot down. And up in Edinburgh, the Duke of Hamilton is also a wing commander, which is a strange coincidence. He's a colonel in the Air Force, and he's actually in charge of the fighter defence station at Edinburgh. Only a mile or 2 outside the city of Edinburgh, he's in charge of the fighter squadron there. He's the commandant. And he gets reports about a lone Messerschmitt 110 flying over the North Sea and approaching Edinburgh. I've seen this, it's in the war diary of his unit. And the question is, what's a Messerschmitt 110 doing up that far in those northern latitudes? Because as the war diary says, it's a very strange thing because this plane will not have enough fuel to get back to Germany. It's not planning to get back to Germany, of course. That's not the plan. But it raises questions. And what also raises questions is he does nothing about it. He doesn't scramble a fighter to shoot it down. Nor does any other squadron in Scotland scramble a fighter. I checked all the record books. None of them scrambles a fighter plane to shoot that plane down. Which rather implies that we knew this was going to be coming, that it was going to be happening, that there's an untold chapter to the whole Rudolf Hess story. They lose sight of the plane. Rudolf Hess has now broken off flying this rectangular pattern, this holding pattern, because it's now dark enough to risk the conclusion of the mission. He identifies a landmark on the coast off Edinburgh, turns, flies due west from that landmark across the whole of the Scottish peninsula, reaches the west coast, finds another landmark he recognizes. He now knows where he is. He turns around exactly 100 degrees, flies from west to east across Scotland the exact number of seconds, counts out the seconds on his clock, turns the Messerschmitt 110 on its back only 1,000 feet above the ground, unlocks the canopy so it flies away, and he drops out into the darkness, making his first ever parachute jump at the age of 47. An extraordinary achievement. Mm-hmm. Everything could have gone wrong. It doesn't. He twists one ankle as he lands very heavily in the darkness. Okay, he's alive. He's only 2 minutes flying time from the Duke's castle. An extraordinary achievement. It's as though the gods had wanted his mission to succeed. He's picked up by the local farmers. He says he's Lieutenant Horn, and the cops come and they take him to a police station cell in Edinburgh. In Edinburgh, he still says he's Lieutenant Horn and he wants to see the Duke of Hamilton. A phone message tells this to the wing commander, Duke of Hamilton. Within 1 hour, the Duke of Hamilton is sitting in the police station talking with Rudolf Hess, the Deputy Führer. What an achievement. I mean, what will later on be described as a lunatic act turns out to be the most brilliant achievement by this man. The British police make an inventory of everything he's carrying. He's carrying a certain amount of English currency, pound notes. He's carrying a little photograph of his son, Rolf Rudiger, who has just turned 4. It's rather sad. He's never going to see that boy again until 30 years have passed. But he carries that photograph with him, and a couple of other photographs. He's also, according to the police inventory, carrying a letter addressed to His Majesty King George VI. A sealed letter. Fascinating. The Duke of Hamilton writes a record, types a record of their conversation. Hess sets out already what the German offer is. He says why he's come. The Duke of Hamilton recognizes him straight away. He says, "You're not Lieutenant Horn, you're Rudolf Hess." And Hess says, "That's correct. I've had to say I'm Lieutenant Horn in order not to be shot as a spy, but I've come here on a mission as a parliamentarian to arrange an end to the war." Churchill is told of this by telephone. he contacts the Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, and he uses a strange word. He says, "We have managed to intercept him." Anthony Eden tells this to Alexander Cadogan, who writes it in his diary that night. Churchill says that they have managed to intercept Rudolf Hess on a mission. Intercept. Again, it implies that we went completely in the dark about what was going on here. The British Secret Service seemed to have had a hand. There's some talk that Hess was actually planning to land near the castle, but then it got too dark and he had to parachute out instead. But whatever. He succeeded. He's spoken to the Duke of Hamilton. The Duke of Hamilton has taken the letter from him, quite clearly. He doesn't mention the letter in any of his reports, which is also significant. What we do know is that 2 days later, the Duke of Hamilton had lunch with the King, because Alexander Cadogan refers to the luncheon in his own handwritten diary. Cadogan was the second man under Anthony Eden. So I think that the Duke of Hamilton gave the letter with the German peace offer to the King of England, not realizing that the King of England has no power whatsoever. He has even less power than President Obama has in this country. I mean, they all think they run the country, but they don't. And in England, it was Churchill who was running the war, not the King. The King has technical powers, constitutional powers as checks and balances. But it doesn't amount to a row of beans, really. Same as President Obama found out. I mean, we were always cheering when he signed those documents when Obama came to power, saying, I decree that Guantanamo Bay shall be shut down within the next 12 months. All these other things that he signed. And none of them has actually been done. Because that's when he found out, this dumb gentleman, that in fact other people run the United States who were not interested in shutting down these camps. Anyway, the King of England has no power. I contacted the Royal Archives, the Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle. I said, can I come and see the letter, please? Can I see your entire files about Rudolf Hess and the King's diary? Because the King hated Churchill. He said this to Mackenzie King, he said it to Sumner Wells, he said it to Harry Hopkins. The Royal Archives wrote back to me a very discreet letter, very polite, saying, we're very sorry, we're not allowed to show you any papers from the Royal Archives. These are being held at the exclusive disposition of Martin Gilbert, the official biographer of Winston Churchill, who never made any use of them whatsoever. One of these days I'll try again and see if I can see that file. I'm convinced the letter reached the King, that Hess's mission was complete. From now on it was up to the King and Winston Churchill. Churchill had no interest at all in ending the war, and he was so happy that it intercepted Rudolf Hess and prevented the German peace offer from getting out. He'd done all he could to prevent the German peace offer getting out. Hitler sent many emissaries, not just Rudolf Hess. Hitler sent a lawyer called Ludwig Weisshaar to contact the British ambassador in Sweden, Victor Mallet. Victor Mallet sent a report on the German offer to the Foreign Office. Hitler also told the German ambassador in Washington, Hans Thomson, to contact the British ambassador and say what he wanted, nothing at all. And the British ambassador in Washington was Lord Lothian. Lord Lothian, a Scottish peer, he reported back to London. Hans Thomson reported back to Berlin by code, Enigma code, which meant Churchill read it. Hans Thomson saying the British ambassador was very interested in the German peace offer. Churchill immediately ordered Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, tell all your ambassadors around the world they are not ever to entertain visits from the German ambassadors or to listen to any kind of German offer. I've seen that telegram too. I mean, the war gradually falls into place now because Churchill has got his way. The bombing has begun. The British peace movement has ended. Rudolf Hess is now in captivity. Churchill says in one message, he says, I regard Rudolf Hess as being my own personal prisoner. Hess is in Midget Place, Camp X, every conversation being overheard by hidden microphones. He realizes after a week or two that he is not going to succeed. That, I think, is when the schizophrenia really kicks in. That is the traumatic realization that he has failed. Far from being the great hero, now he's going to be regarded as a failure and a lunatic. Worse than that, he also regards himself as being a possible danger to Germany, to the fatherland, because he is a bearer of secrets, of course. He knows an awful lot that the enemy must never find out. He may at any time inadvertently blurt these secrets out, or these perfidious British may use truth drugs on him. Perish the thought. He decides to kill himself. At the end of June 1941, he puts on the uniform, which he reserves for special occasions. The sad, symbolic uniform. He puts on the uniform, the flying boots, the uniform, the tunic, the hat. He throws himself off the top bank balcony of this house in Midget Place onto the concrete floor below to try and kill himself. He breaks a lot of bones. He's held in hospital for a month or two, treated as a cripple. He fails to kill himself. It was a suicide attempt, the first of several suicide attempts he made during the war, because he wanted to avoid inadvertently damaging his fatherland by revealing secrets. In May 1944, the Secret Service in Britain sends one of his doctors, a man called Dr. Dix, D-I-C-K-S, born in Latvia, to try using truth drugs on Rudolf Hess. And Dix injects him with sodium pentothal, and there's a recording of the whole conversation where Rudolf Hess manfully, desperately fights off the effects of the narcotic and tries to avoid slipping into this hypnotic trance that the doctor is trying to induce. And the conversation is very weird. It gets weirder and weirder until the end, when the doctor finally loses patience and says, well, we're getting no sense out of you here. Just one final question, then, which you can surely answer. Who are you and what is your rank? And Rudolf Hess straightens up and says, I'm the Deputy Führer of the Great German Reich. My name is Rudolf Hess. So he's won. The doctor gives up, and that's the last time we tried truth drugs on him. In October 1945, he's put on a Dakota plane in Wales, where he's now being held in a castle, and he's returned to Germany, to Nuremberg, because he's been put on the list of top war criminals. He's going to be put on trial. An interesting thing happens. Jackson sends that man, Eric Lippmann, to visit the Rudolf Hess household and see what papers there are. And Lippmann replies to Jackson in the letter saying, this guy isn't a criminal at all. He's the most decent German I've come across. Okay? He's still put on trial because that's the way the powers have decided. And he's put on trial, and for a time he keeps up the charade that he started in Britain in the last month or two of captivity. In a desperate attempt, I think, to try and be repatriated to Germany, as he should have been under the Geneva Convention. Anybody, a prisoner of war who's taken ill, is entitled to be repatriated to his country, which caused a lot of diplomatic anxiety in Britain. Indeed, a lot of correspondence about whether we can keep secret the fact that he's now very clearly ill, has a mental problem, and it's our fault. And this had to be kept secret. He started a charade, a very, very clever act of loss of memory. Desperate loss of memory. He'd forgotten absolutely everything about his earlier years, who he was, who he'd been with, what he had done, what his mission was. He kept up this charade, even as the Dakota took off, brought him back to Germany with all his papers. As he went back to Germany, of course, all his papers went with him. These crazy writings of his, these little screwed up twists of paper containing food samples he wanted to have analyzed for poison by some independent forensic laboratory. And the 26 exercise books also inadvertently went with him because they were part of the Rudolf Hess case that had to go to Nuremberg, which is, thank God, how I found them. If they'd stayed in the British archives, they would never have been released because under British law, medical records remained permanently closed. So they would have not been released, but I found them in the American archives. And he kept up the charade. After a few weeks, November 1945, the best American interrogator of the lot, Colonel John Armin, sent for him, saying to his staff, I can break this guy, and I can break his mask of forgotten memory. I can prove that his memory is as good as anything. And there's a photograph in the book of Colonel John Armin, surrounded by top American officers in his office at Nuremberg, the Palace of Justice. He's sent for Rudolf Hess from the cells. The prisoner has been brought up to him, prisoner number 7. There's Rudolf Hess lolling in the chair in front of this American interrogator, Colonel John Armin, who's obviously in civil life a qualified trial counsel. And it's a big day in Rudolf Hess's life, make or break, so he's put on the uniform again, the flying uniform. There's the flying boots, and the Luftwaffe tunic, and the Snoop helmet is all there, which he always put on a big day. And Colonel John Armin can't break him. He tries everything. He brings people in. He brings them on Rudolf Hess, saying, you know, this guy, looks for a flicker of recognition. No, I don't know him at all. I remember, you don't understand. I remember nothing at all. Finally, the trump card. Sent to Hermann Göring. He's brought in. Hermann Göring himself, pompous, fat, inflated, Reichsmarschall of the Great German Reich, chief huntsman, chief of the 4-year plan, all these other things he's brought in. Sees Rudolf Hess sitting there. Oh, Rudolf Hess, you old fraud. You know me? Rudolf Hess, no. Do I know you? Hermann Göring says, well, he gets very angry. He says, don't be a stupid ass. He says, you know bloody well who I am. I'm Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, chief of the German Reich, successor to Adolf Hitler. Rudolf Hess says, don't think I do know you. On the other hand, he says, You do seem at one time to have been a very important person, but not now, of course. And the transcript of that recorded conversation is in the book, because it's so funny to see him keeping up the show. And a few days later, the trial begins, November 1945. The defendants are led into court one at a time and told to plead. How do they plead? Nobody pleads guilty. Hammond, Goering, and the rest of them, none of them pleads guilty. There's British Judge, Lord Chief Justice Lawrence, very puffed up, British, pompous judge. And he comes to Rudolf Hess, and Rudolf Hess begins a long rigmarole, and he's interrupted by the judge, who says, "That will be taken as a plea of not guilty." Rudolf Hess says, one more thing I want to say. And very well then, he's allowed to make a statement. And Rudolf Hess says, "I haven't lost my memory at all. I fooled the lot of them. I fooled all of you. I fooled all the Germans, the Russians, the French, the Soviets, the consultants, the psychiatrists, the doctors. They all swore back as white. They all swore blindly that in their expert opinion I had lost my memory, total amnesia. The whole thing was a fraud. I fooled a lot of you. My memory is as clear as a bell. What do you want to know?" And his lawyer, Alfred Sider, the little guy, used to know, very small, his head sunk in his hands, a picture of dejection. His trial been turned into a farce by his client. He's sentenced to life imprisonment. So there's a horse trading. The Russians, I've got the records in Syracuse University, the records of the American judge, Mr. Justice Biddle. He describes in particular detail what we call the discussion on the prize giving. The whole day-long deliberations between the judges on what sentences to hand down, and the Russians demanding death sentences all round, and the Americans saying that General Jodl and the other ones are decent and they should be acquitted, or in prison, and the Russians say, "Okay, we'll do it." So they did a deal. They said, we'll agree that Rudolf Hess shouldn't be hanged, that Rudolf Hess can be given life imprisonment if you agree to hang General Jodl. It's a horse trade. So General Jodl is duly hanged. Rudolf Hess shuffles off eventually to Spandau prison. They're held in Nuremberg prison for a number of months until about April 1947. In fact, about 6 months after the end of the trial, while a special prison is built for them in Berlin. Berlin, by that time, has four-power status. It's like a cake lodged in the middle of the Soviet zone of Germany, miles behind the Iron Curtain. Berlin itself had four-power status. It was a cake divided up into four slices between the British, the French, the Russians, and the Americans. Spandau prison was in the British sector of Berlin, which is complicating. And it kept on like that for the next 50 years almost, because the four-power prison in Berlin remained finally the only place where the four powers still met. It was the only interface between the four Allied powers. People say, why did they maintain it? And they said, well, they had to. It had a very useful kind of diplomatic purpose. It provided a round table around which all the four powers could still meet way into the 1980s. Otherwise, they had no other kind of meeting place. But it gradually grew old. The years passed. 1966, Albert Speer was released after his 20 years, and Baldur von Schirach was released. I knew Albert Speer. I spent several days with him. He read his memoirs to me. I don't like him at all. He'd really deserve to be hanged. But he managed to fake his diaries, sanitized them, and gave a sanitized version of his diaries to German government archives. I've seen the real diaries. So those two prisoners were released, which left Rudolf Hess as being the sole remaining prisoner, in Spandau prisoner. A huge red block complex in Spandau, British sector of Berlin. 600 cells, all of them empty except for Rudolf Hess. There's 100 guards required every time, required rotating around the clock once every month. The guards change between the British and the French and the Russians and the Americans. It cost $100 million a year to run the prison for just Rudolf Hess. And he didn't do the favor of dying. He lived on until the age of 93. He would have lived on even longer. If he'd lived on just 2 more years and the wall had come down, then eventually he would have been released. He lived on. He outlived all his successors and tormentors. He outlived the presidents. He outlived the prime ministers. He outlived all the prosecutors and lawyers who had put him in prison. He was the only survivor. He and his uniform. The uniform stayed in the cell with him, hung on a peg behind his cell door, where the British soldiers eventually found it and stole it. And he lived on, and about 4 years before the end, he wrote or dictated a letter to the governors of Spandau prison, setting out his own medical predicament now. He said, I'm now approaching 90, that I'm completely crippled by arthritis. I can no longer stand up by myself without support. I can't dress, I can't wash, I can't tie my shoelaces, I can't raise my hands above my shoulders or above elbow height. They gave him a nurse, a male nurse, to look after him, a man called Abdullah Malawi, a Tunisian, qualified in every respect, been taken several university medical courses. He was highly qualified. He's written memoirs because he knows what happened. Abdullah Malawi wrote a book which will never see the bestseller lists for obvious reasons. More important, he also swore an affidavit a few years later describing exactly what happened that day, August the 17th, 1987. By that time, Rudolf Hess was 47 years in prison. He spent literally half his life in prison, the last 23 years or so in solitary confinement. So if you want to talk about crimes against humanity, it's not very far. You don't have to look very far to find a crime against humanity. He got up that day, as usual, according to Abdullah Malawi, and the male nurse washed him and helped him to get dressed. And Rudolf Hess said to him perfectly normally, he said, when you're out at lunchtime, he said, can you get another flower pot? He said, this flower pot here has got cracked and wants to replace it. And Malawi says in the affidavit, he said, he wasn't trying to get rid of me for some special purpose. He said he knew that I spent every lunch hour out of the prison. My apartment was outside the perimeter of the prison and just nearby, but I would always go out for lunch. And when I was out for lunch looking after finding a flower pot, I got an urgent call to come back to the prison. There had been an incident. And when I got back to the prison, it was a beehive. There were officers I'd never seen before. High American officers. It was the American month. It was the American officers I'd never seen before. High-ranking officers who I didn't identify, I didn't know, and they were all milling around, and I was required to go into the hut, and the hut looked like it had been hit by a bomb. There'd obviously been a big fight there. Tables had been overturned in the hut. The hut was a wooden garden hut where Rudolf Hess sat every afternoon when the weather was fine, with one wall was entirely mesh, and he would just sit there looking out over the garden that he and the prisoners had laid out over the previous 47 years. It was something pleasant for him. Had nothing else to look forward to. And but now the tables have been turned over, the chairs have been thrown around. The straw tile carpet of the hut had been, which they had spent the previous evening, he said, actually straightening out and laying flat, had been rumpled up into a heap in one corner. And he said, I did notice that the standard lamp was still plugged into the wall. And Rudolf Hess lying dead on the floor, apparently dead. I spent half an hour trying to resuscitate him with artificial respiration, but failed. The equipment was brought in, that failed to resuscitate him. And he was taken away to the British Army Hospital and pronounced dead at 4:10 that afternoon. He said, in my opinion, he was murdered. No question. The British announced the death that afternoon. I was flying back from Potsdam, East Germany that afternoon. I'd taken a taxi from Heathrow back to London, and when the taxi driver's radio brought the news, when I got back to my apartment, I went down on my knees and I prayed for the soul of Rudolf Hess, because I knew he was a good man. 2 days later, the British announced he committed suicide. A day or two after that, the United States found a suicide note in his pocket, undated. Malawi's description makes plain that Rudolf Hess, lying on the floor of the hut, was not wearing the flying officer's uniform. He was wearing his regular prison clothes, which I think is probably a key pointer to the fact that it wasn't suicide. He put on that uniform for every other important day of his life since the peace mission. And this was going to be the most important day of his life after all, if he intended to kill himself. The British said that he had suspended himself on the cable of that lamp. He had tied a noose in the lamp, put it around his neck, and made a loop in the other end of the cable and hung it over a hook high above the window in that hut, and then he had sat down until he was dead, hanging himself. A few weeks later, they returned the body to the family, to Rudolf Hess's son, Wolf. Wolf has told me what happened next. He said the British had sealed the body into a steel coffin, which had been welded shut. One mustn't draw any conclusions from the British doing things like welding a coffin shut. They told Rudolf Hess, his son, they said, we want you to take the body down to Wunsiedel, to the family plot, where you're allowed to bury it with no family ceremony, with no ceremony at all, and no fuss, no publicity. He didn't turn left, he says, as he was instructed. He turned right. He took the body to the forensic pathology department of Munich University, where he had the coffin opened with oxyacetylene torches and his father's remains taken out and given a second autopsy by Professor Ottmar Spann, who is Germany's leading forensic pathologist. I've seen the report. The pathologist says the man has been murdered. It's a homicide. There's not the slightest doubt, as evidenced by the scars on the neck left by the ligature. And when a man hangs himself, as in this occasion allegedly, then the scars are diagonal under the waist of the body. When a man is strangled from behind, as happened in this case, then the scar is horizontal across. And I've seen the photographs horizontal across the neck. So there's no doubt at all that he'd met a sticky end. The prison's daily record, his hourly log of goings-on, has been partly published by the British military police only a few weeks ago, and I've read it with great interest. A man features in that, his name blanked out, we know who it is. His name is Tony Jordan. He was the only Negro guard assigned to guard Rudolf Hess, and naturally, between Rudolf Hess and this Negro guard, Tony Jordan, no love was lost. They were repeatedly arguing and having altercations. And on this occasion, says the prison log, at 2:15 that afternoon, there had been a loud altercation. There had been an incident, followed by an incident. The rest of this paragraph is blanked out. So we don't know what the incident was. Tony Jordan has since then adamantly refused to talk about the case. I've got no idea what happened. The British government decided not to investigate. The Berlin police decided to investigate. A couple of years later, I had a visit from the chief Berlin prosecutor, a man called Detlev Melis. If you Google that name now, you'll find out that he's chief United Nations investigator for assassinations like the assassination of the president of Lebanon, Harari. So he got his reward. But he came to visit me at the time, a year or two later, because he was investigating something else. In fact, he was investigating the theft of Hermann Goering's final letters before he committed suicide. They too ended up on the auction block. It turned out that the head of the Berlin Document Center, an American, had been quietly de-accessioning stuff and selling it. Anyway, Detlev Melis told me privately, so we began to investigate the death of Rudolf Hess, as we were required to. It happened on German soil, and we received an instruction from the British Foreign Office to halt and desist from the investigation immediately. So this strange case of how a man could die under very suspicious circumstances, a man of such prominence. There was no investigation at all made. British military police carried out an investigation and questioned a number of people, but the report has been heavily redacted and we don't know what actually conclusions are found. The British went to great lengths to destroy the scene of the crime within an hour or two of the death. The cable was never tested for fingerprints or DNA traces or anything like that. The cable that had allegedly been used in the strangulation, I don't know, the Malawi thinks it wasn't. He said that cable was still plugged into the wall and into the hut. So the case remains a mystery. Motive, if it was murder, 3 or 4, possibly some GI had taken pity on the old guy and put him out of his misery. Here he was, 93 and a cripple and being held on like this. Possibly hatred. Some GI had been so hyped up on American movies about the Holocaust that he thought, here we are looking after and feeding the arch criminal. Being kept up all day and night looking after him. Possibly something really arcane, perhaps some real estate developer had been promised that plot of land. Spandau prison was broken down within 1 day. They had the bulldozers moved in and they ripped the whole building down and left the plot of land completely empty. Perhaps some real estate developer wanted to erect a supermarket and he'd been waiting, standing by with his capital already, and that old fool was still living on, and so 10,000 Deutschmarks to a GI would be money well spent. In fact, there stands a supermarket on that site now, directly on the side. Except, no trace of Spandau except for the tree that the prisoners planted. Those who know which tree it is. If any man deserved the Nobel Peace Prize in his lifetime, in my view, it was Rudolf Hess. But it would have been politically inappropriate to give it to that man, because to do so would have been a black mark against all the war leaders on both sides. This was a man who risked his life, made his first ever parachute jump at the age of 47 into the darkness, did everything. He refused to see his son for the next 30 years. He said, I don't want my son to see me in prison. I will not see him until I am a free man again and my mission is at an end. Those are the words he used. He was buried in Wunsiedel, and an epitaph was erected over the grave by the family, which quoted from a letter that he had written to his wife. One line that said, I took the risk and it was worth it. Ich habe es gewagt. That was the end of the story of Rudolf Hess, until 2 years ago they decided even the epitaph had to be destroyed. Fortunately, there are real historians around who know what actually happened and why. And we take the risk also to publish what we find. That's what I've done in this book. Thank you. We'll have a pause. Perhaps there may be some more coffee has been brewed outside. And then we'll take some questions. No know where to go, please. Let's go to irvingbooks.com. Okay. And these are going ahead. Okay, thank you very much.
10 minutes to order.
Rudolf Hess had actually been born in the British Empire. One reason why he was very fond of the British. Adolf Hitler was fond of the British too, and rightly so, if I may say so. Rudolf Hess had been born in Egypt, in Alexandria. His parents lived in Egypt. His father was a businessman. His father continued to work and live in Egypt until the outbreak of World War II, his mother too. Which is very fortunate for us, because the British are not very picky when it comes to respecting people's privacy. They're a bit worse than the NSA. In those days, Rudolf Hess would write regular letters to his mother and father, who were living in Alexandria, reporting on his rise and rise and rise through the Nazi party, until finally he became Hitler's deputy. He was Stellvertreter des Führers, deputy of the Führer. And he wrote all his letters to his mother and father describing his rise and rise. He describes the birth of the little boy Wolf. He describes, in that same year, 1937, the arrival of the Duke of Windsor to stay for a day or two with the Hess family. The Duke of Windsor was, of course, married to an American slut called Wallis Simpson, a divorcee. The Duke of Windsor had been the King of England, but because of his unfortunate marriage, he had to abdicate in 1936. But there he's visiting Germany. He's visiting Hitler, and he's very pro-Hitler. He's very pro-National Socialist. And why not? I can say this here in the privacy of this room. The National Socialist movement and policy wasn't all that bad. It was a nationalist form of socialism, unlike the Marxist internationalist form of socialism with all the miseries that brought. The nationalist form of socialism was so powerful that it won over most of all the communists and socialists into the Nazi party after Hitler came to power. They turned right round and became as extreme right-wing as they were previously extreme left-wing. And the trouble is with National Socialism, although I've just said it was a profoundly sound movement, the trouble with most isms is the ists, the National Socialists, the Nazis. I'm not the person to invent that saying, but I mean, the trouble is quite a lot of the top Nazis were corrupt, and brutal, and vile. And Rudolf Hess wasn't. Rudolf Hess, throughout his rise to the position of Deputy Führer, Rudolf Hess was basically a very decent man. All the Germans recognized this. If they had a beef with the Nazis, the local Nazi mayor or the local Nazi police chief, then they would write to Rudolf Hess and complain, and he would act on it. He would take steps to act on these malfeasances. And I'm not just saying this, that I'm saying this. In fact, after the war was over, after the ghastly tragedy of World War II was finished, the Americans moved in with all their righteous self-justification and set up the Nuremberg trial to put the Nazi war criminals on trial. And they investigated all the criminals, and Rudolf Hess was among them. And they sent an American Army lieutenant called Erich Lippmann, who was probably Jewish. He lived in Florida afterwards. They sent Lippmann to Rudolf Hess's house, the family house. He no longer lived there, of course. He had been in captivity ever since his dramatic flight. But Lippmann went to Rudolf Hess's house to look for evidence that he was a criminal. And all Rudolf Hess's papers were there, going back to the turn of the century, ever since he was born. All the Rudolf Hess files were in the family house in Hinterlang in Bavaria, and Erich Lippmann spent a whole day going through them, and he wrote a letter to the chief American prosecutor in Nuremberg, which I've got. Because I wrote a book on the Nuremberg trials called Nuremberg, the Last Battle. And Justice Robert H. Jackson, who was the American chief prosecutor, a very, very fine man, in fact. Jackson is an idealist. He's one of my heroes. A lot of people don't like Jackson, but I think he set out with the ambition that you could end wars by law, just promulgate a law against making war, and then that'll be the solution, no more killing. He's an idealist. Jackson sent this guy Lippmann to investigate the Hess papers, and much to everyone's surprise, Lippmann wrote a letter back to Jackson, which I found in Jackson's papers. His son let me have access to the papers. Lippmann wrote a letter saying, I've gone through the Rudolf Hess files in his house, and he was a fine guy. We shouldn't be prosecuting him. He was a decent guy. People wrote to him with complaints, and he acted on the complaints. In every case, he wasn't corrupt. He wasn't brutal. He left Germany before the crimes began. We shouldn't be putting him on trial. It's quite an interesting letter, which I've quoted most of it in the book. And it's interesting, since I mentioned the Hess papers, of course. Where are those Hess papers now? The entire history of the Nazi party, as seen by Rudolf Hess, the deputy of Hitler. I've seen them. Hess's son Wolf said, Mr. Irving, one day, because by this time I'd wormed my way into the favor of an awful lot of top former Nazis and their families. Because of the books I write objective, neutral books. And Hess's son, Wolf, said, Mr. Irving, how would you like to read all my father's papers? I didn't know about them. I said, your father's papers? Where are they? And he said, my mother's got them up in her room. In the house. I knew his mother, Ilse Hess. She was a battle-axe of a woman, virago. Hitler hated her because she was so masculine. Hitler was kind of, he liked the feminine, blonde, soft women. This Rudolf Hess's wife, Ilse, was certainly, at that time, when I went to that house, Rudolf Hess said, I'll tell you what we'll do. We've got a guest room downstairs. I'll install you there for a couple of weeks. And I will smuggle every day 2 or 3 of those ring binders into your room, and you can read them. I said, Wolf, I will go one stage further. I will list their contents for you. I will write an inventory of the contents of the Hess papers. And I did about 80 or 90% of those files in the 2 weeks I was there. I put my list on the internet. If you just look for Hess on my website, you'll find the inventory that I made. But I'm like that. As soon as I find something, I immediately make it available to others. People say, well, where are those files now? Because Hess is dead, his mother's dead. I'll tell you where they are now. They're in a government archives. Not the German government archives. They're in the Swiss government archives. Rudolf Hess, his son, gave the family papers to the Swiss government to look after, and they're now available in the Swiss government archives in Bern, in Switzerland, because he didn't trust the German government and he's probably not wrong. When you think what the German government did 2 years ago to the Hess family grave, the entire grave site, the whole family, Rudolf Hess, his wife, the family, the sons, everybody, their graves have been dug up 2 years ago, and they have been totally destroyed. The contents have been cremated, the ashes scattered across the countryside. Could you do me a favor, please, and just turn the lock on the door, please?
Yeah.
Not exactly. No, not that one. No, just the lock. Just turn the lock. That's right.
They want me to tell them to. Tell them to.
No, it's okay. They've got a right to have their conference next door. But
oh, there's a conference in there.
if there's something going on there. So that's what the government did to the Rudolf Hess legend, or to his memory. They've done everything they can to wipe it out, because it's an awkwardness for the present German government that there was a decent Nazi who, unlike everybody else in World War II, did all he could to stop the madness while he still could, and risked his life in the process. He'd been born in Egypt. He stood by Hitler shoulder to shoulder during the uprising in Munich. He went to prison with Hitler and served 1.5 years in prison in this fortress in Landsberg, south of Munich. And while he was in that prison, Adolf Hitler did what I did. He sat down and he wrote Mein Kampf, his famous book. The question is that all his fellow prisoners helped him. Rudolf Hess wrote bits of it, and Hans Frank wrote bits of it, and the other Nazis wrote bits of it. So you're never quite sure, when you're looking at Mein Kampf, which I personally did not bother to read because it's before my time, so to speak, you're never quite sure which parts Adolf Hitler wrote and which part his pals, his fellow inmates wrote. There are much better sources. If you're interested in knowing what Hitler actually thought, there are much better sources than Mein Kampf. I mean, he made millions out of Mein Kampf. The royalties on that kept him afloat, and he became a generous philanthropist. If I can use that word, philanthropist, and he gave the money to people who needed it. If desperate mothers wrote to him, they couldn't afford to pay the bills, and he would dictate to an adjutant, send that woman 100 Deutschmarks on me, 100 Reichsmarks. But much better sources on Hitler. For example, a few years later, he wrote a second book, which is now available, called Hitler's Second Book. It's been translated and edited in the United States by a man called Gerhard Weinberg, an American historian. You can Google it, Gerhard Weinberg, Hitler's Second Book. You can probably buy it on Amazon or somewhere. It's written in Hitler's handwriting, with excellent commentary by Weinberg, because Weinberg was Jewish but neutral, Jewish but reliable. He's a good historian. And Hitler then went on to spread his opinions in other manners than writing, because he grew tired of writing. But there are other sources that tell us what he actually thought. Hitler's Table Talk. If you can find a copy of that book, again on Amazon, Hitler's Table Talk, which was literally a record written down every mealtime from 1941 to 1944. So what Hitler says, written down by a civil servant called Heinrich Heim. I knew Heinrich Heim. A funny little guy. He was Martin Bormann's adjutant. And he had the job of sitting at Hitler's lunch table and dinner table and discreetly taking notes, and then immediately going to his office and typing up a record in the first person of what Adolf Hitler had said. And then you find out how extraordinarily knowledgeable Hitler was. he had immersed himself in books during all the early years. And he was extraordinarily knowledgeable, and his ideas and opinions were wonderful. And I had a woman who working for me, Elke Fröhlich, who later on edited the Goebbels Diary, as a very well-known German historian. She came, lived with us in Spain for a month, and she read Hitler's Table Talk. And she said, it's extraordinary, the way that this man, he knew everything, and his opinions are so sound. And this is regular German historian. She said, extraordinary that he even understands the female mentality so well. And I've got to admit that he's way ahead of me. I don't understand. They live on a different planet. I mean, we can be frank here in this room, gentlemen. They live on a different planet. They speak a different tongue. They appear to speak the same language as us, but they understand each other even without speaking. You drive down an interstate, and there's a big empty billboard that's waiting for the message to be put on it. And it isn't empty. There's actually a message to women. They can read it. And they're nodding and saying, absolutely right, I must get one of them. And they've got a different microchip, they've got a different operating system from us. I mean, now that we all have computers, we now understand operating systems and microchips. And they've got sentences hardwired into their microchip that we don't have. Here's one that they've used. I mean, everyone in this room will have heard it. If you don't know what you've done to upset me, I'm not going to tell you.
I know what you're thinking.
Every language, they've got that sentence.